Good evening. Is this working? Welcome to Empower You and our first class of our 16th semester. It's good to have you here. For people that are new to Empower You began in 2011. It was founded by Dan Reginald, who is also the founder and CEO of Frame USA. And his vision for Empower You was to present classes in and around the city at that time, before we had the studio, and on a diverse number of topics. And our mission is to engage our audience, to empower them, but most of all to educate them. But we also want you to enjoy. So we do have some classes that are just for enjoyment. Every class that's held here in our studio is live streamed. So within 2 days of our class, you'll find it posted on our website if you ever want to go back and see it again, or recommend it to a friend who couldn't make it here tonight. We are a free university powered by donations. So at the end of each of our class, we do pass around buckets. Any donation that you would like to give to us is very much appreciated to help towards our cost to keep this going. Please feel free to provide any comments on any class that you attend, and also to give any ideas that you might have, because a lot of our classes do come from ideas that our audience gives to us. You can send those to info@empoweruohio.org. At the end of the speaker's presentation tonight, he will be taking questions. When he's ready for that, if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you to bring a microphone so that everyone in the audience can hear your question, especially those online can't hear. So just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. Next, I'd like to tell you about our next 4 upcoming classes. On Thursday night, we have a class called Tobacco, Trust, and Trump. And that was written by a local gentleman. He lives in Dayton now, Jim Rumford. And it has to do with the tobacco wars in the early 1900s. I don't know if anybody here has heard of the tobacco wars, but I hadn't. And everybody I've asked said, no, we never heard of them. So actually that war went on amongst a certain group of people like the tobacco farmers. What's interesting about Jim Rumford is both of his great-grandfathers were involved in this war, but they were on each side of it. So it's quite an interesting story he has to tell. But the reason he wrote the book and the reason he's trying to get the word out is a lot of things that went on in the 1900s during that war is the same things that are going on today as far as monopolies like Amazon and Facebook. So it should be a really great class. If you haven't registered for it, I hope you will. You won't want to miss it. On Saturday, we have Constitution Boot Camp. I think that speaks for itself. That's being directed towards our kids mainly. There is a charge for that class, but for any student, college age and younger, who completes the class, there will be a $25 GameStop card given to them. Then on next Monday, we have a class called Think and Grow Rich. It's going to be held by 2 speakers, Tim Burgess and Al Lindemann. I don't know anybody who doesn't want to grow rich, so I don't think you're going to want to miss this class. But Think and Grow Rich is a book that was published back in 1937, and it was written by Napoleon Hill. And the principles that he applied then still applies today. So these 2 gentlemen will be giving you the 6, I forget what you call them, but 6 principles to go by to be successful, whether it's in business or your personal life. If you want to lose weight, it'll work for that too. And then next Thursday, we have the Brick of Murder class. If you're from Cincinnati, especially if you're from the West Side, you know about the Brick of Murders. The Brick of Murders go back to September 1966, and it is probably the most notorious unsolved case in Cincinnati. J.T. Townsend, who is a true crime writer in the local area, has written on this before, and he's also held a class for us at one time. But next week's class is going to be different because since he held a class quite a number of years ago, the case files on this class have been released, and he has had access to those. He has gotten so much new information that he wrote a book just on this case, and he's going to be presenting that all next week. So it'll be really interesting. I hope all of you can at least sign up for some of those classes if not all of them. And did everybody here receive a red ticket when they came in? Because it's time for a door prize. So pull out your red ticket. Will you pull one for me? It probably will be. No, it's not. No, no, sorry. The last 3 digits, 774. Congratulations. We have a framed copy of the Constitution up here for you. If you'd like, you can pick that up at the end of the class. You're welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce our managing board member, Dan Reganold.
Thank you. And sir, what's your name in the back who won the prize? Sir in the back, what's your name? Tony Kruger. Let's give it up for Tony. So how many of you were at our season ending class back in May? Were any of you there? So there's a guy that was here that had to duck out before the class was over, and he is our voice of Empower You, the one, the only, Don Hurd. Of Empower You. Come on up, Don.
There's a surprise.
And so that's for you. Just since Don happened to be here tonight, I thought maybe we could ask him to sing the national anthem for us. What would you guys think? I was expecting Betty to recite our official national anthem policy before, you know, when she was up here, but our policy is that we stand, right? Right. So everybody stand, please. To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed the twilight's last gleam, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, where the ramparts streaming, and the rockets were the bombs bursting in air, came through the night. Our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? The land of the free, the home of the brave. Boys, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. So, a couple people I want to thank tonight before we get going. I have a couple things I want to talk to you about. I want to thank our team tonight. We've got a great team. We've got Betty Overstreet, who is Community Relations Manager. We've got Bill Roll, our treasurer. Jill Google, who got us the incredible cake. We hope you can have a piece of when tonight's over. Let's give them a round of applause. Also, Joe Platt, who's one of our great board members, is in the back also. So I'm just so glad to see you again. It seems like it's been an eventful summer for me, but I'm glad to be back at Empower You. Empower You is now, this is our 16th semester. So that's 8 years. And it seems like, gosh, it's like 350 or 400 classes we've taught, and it's always fun. So we're back. It's good to be back. It's good to see you all. So I was going to tell you about my what I did on my summer vacation, but we're on a tight timeline tonight. But I did have a great summer. It was busy and did a lot of things. I just wanted to bring you up to date to our good friend, Christopher Smitherman, who was at our season-ending event. He knew you were all going to be here tonight. He wanted me to tell you about a new podcast he started called Independently Speaking. I've heard it. He's got such a voice of reason and common sense. If you like to listen to podcasts in the car, I encourage you to bring that one up and take a listen to it. And Christopher has also announced, I don't know if you've heard or not, that he is running for the mayor of Cincinnati in 2021, which will be exciting. So we've got 19 great classes. Hope to see you at a lot of them. And what I wanted to talk to you about, I wanted to challenge you a little bit and talk to some of the initiatives we've had at Empower You, because I wanted you all to help us come up with what initiative we're going to sponsor this year. Every year we try to do one thing. We try to get wrapped up in one thing. And in 2011, our very first initiative, and one of the reasons I'm so interested in our speaker tonight, we formed a coalition called WeDemandABalanceBudget.com, where we tried to force Congress to pass balanced budget legislation. And we got about 15,000 people to sign up, some big people, and we just couldn't quite get over the edge. I know that's what our speaker's going to talk about, but it's not so much when you're trying to get empowered in your life about what you win and what you don't win on. What it's all about is that you try. And so we always love trying new things that empower you. In 2012, we participated and helped lead the initiative to end Ohio's estate tax, which was a tax that was driving wealthy people out of Ohio when they got older, because they all would want to leave and go down to Florida so they didn't have to pay tax. We were very successful with that. We saved really people. In 2013, we began to examine probably the most popular, not the most popular, but the single most prevalent class we've done, where we looked at the Metropolitan Sewer District and the complete mess that's down there. And I think we're due to have another one of those classes very soon. In 2014, Empower You formed a Citizens Advisory Board, and we recommended that Music Hall not be included in a countywide sales tax. And that recommendation ended up saving about $100 million in tax. And what happened at Music Hall? A bunch of rich people renovated it anyway. So it was a great thing. And as good as that, we saved probably the most iconic building in Cincinnati in the process. In 2015, we took a serious look at human trafficking, the subject of human trafficking. We looked at what's happening with the plight. Senator Portman joined us that night. Number of judges. You remember being part of the Media Accountability Project. We looked at the Cincinnati Enquirer, our favorite newspaper, 2 weeks before the election. And what we found, surprisingly, was that 74% of all the column inches in the Cincinnati Enquirer were in Hillary Clinton's favor. And during that initiative, 232 people made the pledge to stop their subscription to the Enquirer for at least 90 days. In 2017, our initiative was called Simplify the IRS. We tried to legislatures to reduce the importance of the IRS and to allow 90% of the citizens to be able to fill out their tax obligation on a single postcard. So my question is, what should Empower You's initiative be this year? I've got some postcards on the way out. You're grabbing a piece of cake. If there's anything you think we ought to concentrate on that would be fun, a good project to undertake, please write. And at our class on how to become an activist on October 2nd, we will be we can throw our Kugel. And I don't know if anybody has any idea what that stands for or not. Imagination. It's great to see you here tonight. Great to have you here for our speaker for our first Empower You session. And I want to introduce you to Joe Platt, our board member, who's going to introduce our speaker. Welcome, everybody. Thank you.
Raffle. So the only good thing I have to offer you is that I will be short in my introduction, Mr. Meckler. Mr. Meckler is a nationally known speaker. He's been featured on Mark Levin's TV show. He's an American political activist and attorney who's the co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots. Mr. Meckler currently serves as the president of Citizens for Governance and the Convention of States Project. He's an active proponent of the convention to propose amendments to the United States Constitution. Mr. Meckler, stop this.
We're going to be okay here on feedback? My wife sometimes says my voice is grating, but not quite that bad. So thanks, Dan and Joe, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I think it's, first of all, really extraordinary facility here. I get a chance to travel all over the country, and I've not seen anything like this anywhere. So I think it's a testament to your community. It's a testament to Dan and the board that something like this even exists. In fact, I intend to learn more about it because this needs to be spread all over the country. So a big round of applause for Dan and the board and the folks here at Empower You. One of the things that I think is really important is that we acknowledge why we're here today. We've got a bad buzz, guys. Anything I can do about that? Testing 1, 2, 3. Should I move? Yeah, back? We're still buzzing all over the place. How's that? Is that better? I don't know if it's the mic or what, if you want to replace me, but I can keep talking while you do. Okay, so here's why we're here. We're here because today is September 17th. September 17th is an incredibly important day in American history. Perhaps the most important day in American history, if you think about it, as the day that birthed the document on which our entire system of governance is based. And it's an entirely unique system of governance pretty much in all of human history. In fact, you'd have to go back to biblical times, to the period of the judges, to find anything that's even a close equivalent to what we're talking about here today. And that is a constitutional form of government based on the idea that people should be and are inherently imbued with the right to govern themselves. Self-governance, free will. This is an idea on which America is based, and it is an unusual idea in all of human history. How many of you have read more history in the last 10 years than you have in your entire lives? Raise your hand if you become. This is an amazing thing to me. Can you guys raise your hands again and then look around the audience for me? This is really amazing, okay? So a lot of us went to public school. I grew up, and you have to forgive me, my knowledge of history probably less than yours. I went to public school in Los Angeles, California. So I have a little bit of an excuse there. But I think for most of us in this country, our understanding of knowledge of what I would describe as true American history was relatively limited. About 10 years ago, a little bit less than that, there was a renaissance in American history that boomed in this country. And it actually really started with the Tea Party movement. Some of you might have been involved in reading history before that. I really wasn't. I knew the history that I had been taught in high school and junior high school. I knew history from college. I went to law school. Don't hold that against me, but don't worry, they don't actually teach you any real history in law school. And so we had studied all these years and learned almost nothing, I think, about true American history. And certainly, in my opinion, not the truth of what leads us to September 17th, 1787. I think this is a critically important piece of American history that we should recount, and I'm going to start with that. I'm going to start us back in before 1787. In fact, I'm going to go back before the American Revolution. Now, I'm going to go all the way back to Jamestown, if you'll go with me. And we had the Mayflower Compact in Jamestown. Probably most of you learned about that in junior high and high school, maybe even in grammar school. If you studied any American history in college, you might have studied again the Mayflower Compact. And then mostly, if you're a student of standard American history as taught in American schools today, the next thing that you will learn after Jamestown is the American Revolution, the next major event in American history, right? That's what we learned. That's what I remember from school, literally from grammar school all the way through college. But as I went back and started to study American history, a question appeared to me on the timeline, something that seems so obvious. And in fact, it was actually brought up by somebody in a meeting like this first. Somebody asked me a question. They said, Mark, what was the period of time between Jamestown and the American Revolution? How long was that? And I went back into the filing cabinet of my mind, into the dusty, dark recesses of that filing cabinet, and I found nothing. Literally, I had no idea. I didn't even have a guess. That just never occurred to me. And he said, take a wild guess. And I thought, was it 75 years, 100 years? I have no idea. And he told me it was 158 years. And that really stunned me. That's 5 generations of time in American history where largely we are taught nothing about our history. Nothing. Is that because there was no history? Maybe nothing important happened in that 158 years between the Mayflower Compact and the American Revolution. But I went back and I started to do my reading, and I started to dig into the history, and I started to figure out what happened during that period. And I would argue today, and I am profoundly committed to this idea, that that is the most important period in American history. Before we become a country, before we have the American Revolution, something unique happens here on this continent in that time period that's never before happened in human history, and that is a people set free completely to govern themselves. You've heard the term benign neglect. We came over here. We were still theoretically subject to the crown and other foreign governments, but people were here thousands of miles from any sort of official authority. And what authority was here, very limited in its ability to do any enforcing of what they believed was correct or according to government strictures. And so people had to learn to govern themselves. That's important. Isn't that important? I think that's incredible. So by the time you get to the American Revolution, you have over 150 years of people governing themselves. I think what happened during that time period and what it leads to can be best summed up by a guy by the name of Captain Levi Preston. You can find this story on the internet. You won't find it in any history books. Preston was a captain in the Continental Army. He was right there at the original battles in Lexington and Concord, among the men who fired the first shots that started the American Revolution. And he was a farmer. He was 23 years old when the revolution started. And when he recounts the story, he is actually 91 years old, living in North Carolina. A young historian by the name of Mellon Chamberlain is traveling the country, still a young country at the time, and he's collecting the oral histories of the last remaining Minutemen. Now, I want you to think about this. It's 1843. These people are pretty old by those standards. Back then, the life expectancy was 54 years of age for the average male. So you've got Captain Preston living into his 90s. Mellon Chamberlain crosses his path in North Carolina and asks him a series of questions where he's trying to define why, in Captain Levi Preston's mind, in the mind of all the original Minutemen, why did they fight? What brought them out onto the field of battle? And he asks a series of questions. I'll paraphrase. You can read the whole interview online. And he asks these questions. He says to Captain Preston, what was it that brought you to the field of battle that day? Was it the Stamp Act? Were you frustrated and felt oppressed because you had to buy the stamps and place them in all your official documents? Preston says very clearly, the governor locked the stamps in the armory. That's the last we ever heard of it. I'm sure I never bought one of them. I don't know about you guys. I read about the Stamp Act. People were pretty upset about the Stamp Act, right? He asked him, well, was it the taxes on the tea? And he said, son, I was a farmer. We never drank no tea. We drank coffee. We heard the boys dumped it in the harbor, but that was the end of that. It's not the Stamp Act. It's not the tea tax. What is it? He asked him, was it British tyranny? Was it the heavy hand of British tyranny? Never felt a whit of it. He never felt the British tyranny. Why did he come out to fight? He asked him, were you reading the great revolutionaries, Milton and Burke and the other revolutionary writers? And he said, never heard of them men you speak of. Those of us who read, we read the Bible, the Almanac, the Psalms, but those men, not familiar with them. And of course, Mellon Chamberlain's a little bit baffled at this point because this is everything he's learned about the American Revolution, right? In 1843, this is why the average American believes, in 1843, why the American Revolution was fought. The same things you and I believe today. The Stamp Act, the tea tax, British tyranny, the great revolutionary writers, Thomas Paine, all this stuff. That's why we think the revolution was fought. And so he goes for the big question and he asks him, well, why then? You are a farmer, a family man, you had everything to lose. Why did you fight? And I think that what Preston says in response to that question is the most profound and simple summary of the American philosophy of governance ever professed. From then until now, And this is what he said. When we went out to face them redcoats that day, we meant only one thing. We had always governed ourselves, and them redcoats, they intended that we shouldn't. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's why we fought the American Revolution. And sometimes it frustrates me because we read the great orators, we read the speeches of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, and we read the stories of George Washington and Madison and Adams, great stories and great men and important stories, but they were not the American Revolution. The American Revolution was made by Levi Preston. Not just Levi, but a lot of people just like Levi Preston. And you know who Levi Preston is today? He's you and you and you. He's everybody in this room. He was just a regular guy. Preston went to fight because he believed that we had always governed ourselves and that we always should. We always intended to. And he believed that there were people, and he was right, who said that we shouldn't. There actually was a precipitating act for the American Revolution, a single precipitating act for the American Revolution. Not much reported on. You can read about this in history books. It was called the Declaratory Act. Anybody ever hear of the Declaratory Act? This is really interesting. We got one guy, two guys in the room that know about the Declaratory Act. So the tea tax is repealed, the Stamp Act is repealed, and Parliament decides it has to do something in response to these pesky colonists, and it passes something called the Declaratory Act. And I'm paraphrasing, you could pull it up and read it, but basically what it says is, hey, you pesky colonists over there, we here in England in Parliament and the King can tell you anything we want to tell you, and you have to do it, and you have no choice. That's it. It's a declaration by Parliament of absolute sovereignty over people who have no say. It is a declaration of servitude, essentially imposed upon the colonies. Sam Adams, my favorite founding father, recognizes this for what it is. It is the quintessential moment in American history where a line has been drawn that must not be allowed to stand. And he rallies his countrymen against that. And this is really the moment, if you read the histories of Adams and the people who flamed and fomented the revolution, this is the line that they understood that could not be crossed. So now I'm going to fast forward across a lot of history, and I'm going to bring us to today. Today, we live in a country where there are people who believe that we should not govern ourselves. Most of them reside in a city called Washington, D.C., far, far away from us. For some of us, I live out in California, thousands and thousands of miles away from us. And they firmly and staunchly believe that you are not capable nor entitled to govern your own lives. And I will tell you, every person in this room, and most people in America, chafe under the thought of that. If we look at the polling today in America, 72% of all Americans, 72% plus, say that the federal government does too much. It's too big. It's involved in too many aspects of our lives. It's a big number. It's not just Republicans. It's not just independents. That's across the board. 72% say Washington, D.C. should back off and get out of our lives. Why? I believe it's because self-governance is inherently wired into who we are as human beings. Certainly, it's in the DNA of all of us as Americans. And so all of you are sitting here today and you're nodding and you're thinking, yeah, I'm tired of those people telling me what to do. So then the question becomes, all these years later, centuries later, what are we going to do about it? You know, I say September 17th, 1787, one of the most important days in American history. But for me personally, I think September 15th is a more important day than September 17th. And here's why I think September 15th is so important. It's my wife's birthday, and I can't forget that or I'm in a lot of trouble. I was home, I was home for the 15th, but it is also what we call Article 5 Day. Colonel George Mason from Virginia, the man who said more at the convention, had more influence on the Constitution than anybody else, and that entire delegation rises and addresses the assembly 2 days before the end of the convention. Now, I want you to imagine this. They've been there for months. You know the story. It was hot. It was humid. They were boarded up inside this thing. 2 days before the end of the convention, the Constitution is basically a complete document. And he stands and he addresses the assembly. You can read it in Madison's notes. He says something like this: "My colleagues, we've made a terrible mistake. The draft before you now has given Congress the power to propose amendments should they deem them necessary, but has not given the same power to the people. acting through their states. And then he asks a question which I think resonates today. And he says, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? I think they laughed. You know, we don't have video, we don't have audio, so we don't know for sure, but I can tell you with 99% certainty that they actually laughed. How can I tell you that? Because I've read Madison's notes and they say something very unusual at this point. They say nin com. In Latin, that means no comment or no debate. That's incredible. They debated everything in that convention, every comma, every sentence, every clause, every paragraph, debated till they couldn't debate anymore, and then they debated it more. But on this point, on the idea that we, the people, acting through our state should have the power to restrain the federal government, they were unanimous. And how do I know it was unanimous? Not only did they not debate, but unanimously they agreed to insert that provision into the United States Constitution. That's extraordinary. That happened September 15th, 1787. 2 days later, the Constitution is a finished document, and they sign it and go home. And that clause, that second clause of Article 5 sits there, and remains dormant until today. I was one of the co-founders of the largest Tea Party organization in the nation. Here's what I want to tell you about that. I take no credit for the Tea Party movement. I've had people on TV, oh, you're one of the founders. That's like saying to a surfer, that's an incredible wave you created, right? The Tea Party movement was in the hearts and minds of the American people. I was privileged enough to be in a good place, and I'll take a little bit of credit for I know how to surf. I'm from California, right? So I rode the wave. But what I saw out of the Tea Party movement was something extraordinary, was that the spirit of self-governance was alive and well in the American body politic. People were frustrated with government overreach. People were frustrated with Washington, D.C. not responding to their needs and their desires, and frankly, their overwhelming demands as expressed in the 2010 election. And you sent the biggest swing class between parties to Congress in 2010 that we've seen in this country since 1938. Anybody participate in that? Raise your hand if you participated in that. Give yourselves a hand. That's pretty extraordinary. You guys made history, right? This is a big deal that you guys did this. And it should have changed a lot. If Washington, D.C. was responsive to our signals, which is what they're supposed to be, then a lot of things would have changed. And I was very naive. I went to Washington, D.C. I was there for the election. I was there that night. I was so excited. We expected everything to change, this huge new class sweeping in. We thought everything would be different. And then nothing. It was the same. Better people into the swamp, and they drowned or got eaten alive by the critters in the swamp. And we watched it happen again after the Republicans took the Senate, didn't we? Because Republicans took the Senate, and for 7 years they promised us, repeal Obamacare, repeal Obama. 7 times they put that bill on President Obama's desk. And then in 16 they get the Senate. They keep putting it on his desk, and then we get the presidency. In 16 we get the presidency, and what happens? They can't even put the bill on the president's desk. It's unbelievable. Congress is no longer responsive to the American people. And the founders told us directly, we do not have to imply, directly what to do when Congress became unresponsive to the American people. They did not, definitively did not tell us, elect better people. You can't find that in the Federalist Papers. In fact, if you read the Federalist Papers, the writings of the founders, they acknowledge that people are bad. You know the saying, if men were angels, no government would be necessary among men. They knew what people were. They knew we were fallen beings. They knew we had greed and envy and all the things that would cause us to be self-serving if we went to Washington, D.C. What they told us is, when it gets out of hand, use Article 5. I have a pretty vivid imagination. My office is in a barn on my property back home in California. Put my feet up on the desk. It's the only table in the house I'm allowed to put my feet up on. Put my boots up on the table. And sometimes I imagine myself in conversation with the founders. My favorite founder to talk to would have been Ben Franklin, I think. I just like cantankerous old guys. He was a cantankerous old guy. I hope someday I get to live long enough to be a cantankerous old guy. And I picture myself talking to Dr. Franklin, and I picture myself lamenting what's going on in the United States of America. And it's Obamacare, and it's this problem, and it's that overreach, and it's the EPA, and it's the fact that you have federal agencies that were never empowered by the Constitution to do the things they're doing. They're in our education, they're in our families, they're in our property rights. And I imagine myself whining and moaning to Dr. Franklin, and we're sipping on a pint of ale, and eventually he stops me. He's like, young man, one moment. Article 5, what about Article 5? We gave you the power to do so. You can take their power away. If they've usurped your power, you have the power to take it back. You are, after all, as citizens, the sovereign in this country. So what about Article 5? And I imagine myself saying, well, Dr. Franklin, people have been kind of scared, and we really haven't just tried. And I imagine this is what he would say. Go away. Leave me alone. You're bothering me, boy. Come back when you've used the tools we provided. That's what I imagine happening. So I told you I was involved in the Tea Party movement in 2012. I stepped away from that, not because I'm not a Tea Partier, I'm still a Tea Partier, not because I don't believe in all the values, but because I believed we didn't have a good plan for fixing the problems that ail the country. That's okay for some people, but I travel around, I have the privilege to do this, and people were saying, what do we do? And I was saying, don't really know. Elect more good people, because that's worked really well, right? So I didn't have an answer. I was really blessed because Mike Ferris came to me with the idea of using Article 5 to call a convention of states. If you're a homeschooler, then you know Mike Ferris. Mike is the founder of Homeschool Legal Defense Association. He's the guy that helped make homeschooling legal in America when it was illegal. Hard to believe there was a time. So I knew he knew how to do things on this large national scale. He had done it with the homeschool movement, and he brought Article 5 to me, and he laid out a plan how it could work, why it could work, and why this was a thing. And I agreed to get involved in the project. I agreed for our organization, Citizens for Self-Governance, to fund the project. That's how it all got started. A lot of you are familiar with Mark Levin. Anybody know Mark Levin in the room? Yeah, there's a few of you know Mark. My favorite old curmudgeon, by the way. Mark wrote the book Liberty Amendments. How many people have read Liberty Amendments? There's quite a few. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. Mark wrote the book Liberty Amendments literally the exact same time Mike and I were starting the Convention of States project. It wasn't coordinated. I had no idea he was doing it. There's a story about how I found out and how Mark found out I was doing this. It was providential, honestly. And his book launched the same week we launched the project. So we got started turbocharged from the first day. So here we are, 5 years later. 12 states have now passed the Convention of States resolution. It takes 34 states to get to a convention. So we need 22 more states. There are 29 states in play next session. Ohio is well in play. Pennsylvania is in play right now. I was just in Michigan. We just passed out of the Senate committee in Michigan. So we passed both committees in the House and Senate in Michigan, getting ready to go to the floor. This thing is a live wire. 5 years later, 3.6 million people support this all over the country. We have folks, representatives in every single state legislative district in the United States of America. That's never been done by any project in the history of America that I'm aware. Not because of me. So it's really important that you understand this. It's just like the Tea Party. This wave exists in America. We're just giving it a place to go, right? So this already exists. I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm not even tooting our organization's horn. It's because people are fed up and frustrated. Any of you frustrated by Washington, D.C.? Yeah, you're frustrated because you send people there and they don't do what you want them to do. State legislators, I've been in 44 states in the last 2 years. You know, one of the most common complaints I hear from state legislators, if we could just get DC to leave us alone. You know, on average, 60 to 65% of every state budget is controlled by Washington, DC in one way or another. That's so offensive. That means you give your representative 100% of your vote and he can exercise 35 to 40% of your vote. That's not right. But that's the system we live in today. We complain about things like Obamacare. We complain about things like the Department of Education. Do you know that there is no constitutional authorization for the federal government to be involved in education? None, zero. You can't find the word be involved in education in the Constitution. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson, the father of public education in the United States of America, was asked when he was forming the University of Virginia, they said, Mr. Jefferson, why don't you get the federal government to help fund this? He said, because that's unconstitutional. That would require a constitutional amendment. Nobody can point that amendment out to me, yet here we are, hundreds of billions of dollars later, no improvement in test scores whatsoever, and the federal government is deeply ensconced in education. So what do we do about it? This is my opinion of what we do about it. We do what the founders told us to do. We use the Constitution to save the Constitution. I want to briefly walk you through how that works. And then I'm going to open it up for questions when I close here. And the questions to me are the most important of all of this. I know there are questions in the audience, and I don't mind if you're opposed. I'm happy to hear everybody's questions. Here's how it works in basics. Constitution says when 2/3 of states make the call or an application for convention, then Congress shall call the convention. Congress's obligation, mandatory language, is what's called a ministerial duty according to the law. It means they name the time and the place and the method of ratification. They have two methods of ratification they can choose, either legislative ratification by your legislatures or what they call state ratifying conventions. That's Congress's only role. There are people who will argue otherwise. I'm happy to have that discussion and answer those questions afterward. Congress names the time and place. Where will it be? I can tell you with 99% certainty. Where do you think, anybody guess where Congress is going to set it? DC. We wish, Kansas. They'll set it in DC. That's where they're going to set it. Every state leader I've talked to says, we'll go to DC for exactly 1 hour. They will fly to DC, they will convene, they will gavel in, they will vote to move it somewhere else in the country, somewhere in the center of the country likely. They will gavel out and they will reconvene somewhere else. That'll be our time and place debate. By the way, I always get questions, what if Congress doesn't call? This is a famous line from a movie. I say, we don't need no stinking Congress, right? The states always have the sovereign right to convene in convention anytime they want to. So if Congress messes around with that, people know we're just going to call a convention. When they get in convention, they adopt a rule set. The rules are standard. We've now had over 40 conventions in American history, all using basically the same set of rules. Today, the state legislatures, about 70% of them use Mason's rules. This body will operate very much deliberatively like a state legislature. It will likely be mostly filled with sitting or former state legislators. They will likely use Mason's rules, used by 70% of state legislatures today. They'll probably layer a couple extra rules on top of it for the purpose of a convention of states or an amendments convention. If you want to see how that works, we held one of these conventions, a simulated convention in Williamsburg about 1.5 years ago. It's online on our website. You can go there and search simulated convention. You can watch hours and hours of how this all works. They get in convention. They will form committees, very much like your legislature, break into committees for the 3 subject matter areas. There are 3 subject matter areas proposed by this resolution. Anything that would impose fiscal restraints on Washington, D.C. Anybody think we need to get their fiscal house in order? Yeah, they're out of control. Anything that would impose term limits on Washington, D.C. Anybody think we need that on Washington, D.C.? By the way, that's not just Congress. How about for the federal judiciary? And how about for the bureaucracies, right? So those are things that can be discussed. And then the final, the exciting one, and to quote my good friend Chris Matthews, the one that makes a tingle go up my leg, is the idea of restraining the scope, the power, and the jurisdiction of the federal government. This gets to the root of the matter. Senator Tom Coburn works with me. They used to call him Dr. No in Congress, I think one of the great American patriots. He says as a physician, he has an absolute obligation to treat the root cause of the disease, not just the symptoms, right? And the root cause of this disease is that the federal government has too darn much power. Everybody agree with that? Too much power in DC. So we have to limit their power. We have the authority to do that. We have the authority to tell them, no, you may not be engaged in education. No, you may not be adjudicating my property rights because I have some kind of wet weather pond on my property. No, you have no right to have the EPA intervening in our state. We can do very well managing our own environment. The Constitution doesn't provide for any of those things for the federal government, but that's where we're at, and we need to take those things away. If I could summarize the single amendment that I would like to see come out of this, it would be this. It would be an amendment that says, no, really, we meant it the first time. That's really the idea, is to go back to the majesty and the beauty and the simplicity of the original Constitution. Now, I have a lot of people say this to me, Mark, they don't follow the Constitution now. What makes you think they would follow it if we passed new amendments? And the answer might surprise you. I am a very conservative guy. I'm going to give you an answer that doesn't sound conservative at all. This is not what the talk show hosts say. This is not what the talking heads on TV say. They actually do mostly follow the Constitution. This is a horrifying truth unknown to most Americans. I encourage you, go to the government publishing office and order a United States Constitution. I think it's on sale right now. It'll cost you about $130. And you're thinking that little pamphlet is $130. No, it's not the pamphlet, right? What the federal government considers the United States Constitution today is over 2,800 pages long. It weighs over 9 pounds, and it contains every bit of case law ever promulgated by the United States Supreme Court to tell us what they believe we should believe that very simple, easy to understand document means. That is the Constitution under which we live. And with notable exceptions, about 95% of what Washington, D.C. does falls within that huge 2,800-page Constitution. I believe we need to fix that. I think our country is at stake. I have a 22-year-old son who is a United States Marine. And when he gave his, thank you, hoorah, when he took the oath, I was there when he took the oath, one of the most emotional things I've ever seen. I'll never forget because he was willing to put his life on the line to defend our Constitution against enemies foreign and domestic. The least I can do is spend my life to prevent the destruction of our Constitution by the domestic enemies. I have a daughter at Hillsdale College. Hardcore, dyed-in-the-wool conservative young lady. I owe it to her. She's committed her life to being a warrior for these principles. I owe it to her. I look around this audience, I know there's a lot of grandparents and parents in this audience. We owe it to our kids and our grandkids and our progeny to do what we can to preserve this great nation. I want to be clear, I'm not telling people that we shouldn't vote. I'm not telling people we shouldn't put great people in office the best we can. I'm telling you, we better vote. I'm telling you, this election, we really better vote. You should vote. You should get your kids to vote. You should get your friends to vote, your church to vote, your family. We got to all vote. That's critically important. But that's baseline. That's not enough. If we are going to fix this country, we are going to do what the founders gave us to do. There's that famous line by Ben Franklin when he comes out of convention, myth or reality, I don't know, but he is asked what they have given to the American public, and he says, a republic if you can keep it. Our job is to keep it. I am committed to keeping it, and in order to do that, I am committed to making sure that we as a nation gather together in a convention to restrain the scope, the power, and the jurisdiction of the federal government. Thank you. So what we want to do now is open it up to questions, right, Dan?
So, Mark, we've got about 35 people online tonight. So if everybody who wants to ask a question, if you'd raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. We'll get that under control. Here's the first question right here. If you'd say your first name, please.
Okay. This may be minutia, but I think words matter. This morning, for the second time, I heard Glenn Beck praise the Article 5, talked about George Mason, 11th hour, saving the country against tyranny and all this. But for the second time, he called it a constitutional convention, not a convention of states. Would you explain to everybody what the difference is? And contact him and let him know, because apparently he's not paying attention to me.
You know, Oki, I've actually had that personal discussion with Glenn, so I'm trying. So this is really important. The words do matter. We're dealing with the most important legal document in our system of governance. So in the law, words really matter, right? And so there is a fundamental difference between a convention of states or an amendments convention and a constitutional convention. And you will hear opponents of this movement try to conflate them. And if they try to conflate them, they're either being disingenuous because they know the difference and they're not telling you the truth, or because they truly don't know the difference. And here's the difference. I'm going to use a big legal word. I apologize. I'm a lawyer. I'm not getting paid extra for this word, but here's the word. The word is plenipotentiary. A constitutional convention is a convention with plenipotentiary powers, and that means that it is all powerful. It means it starts from scratch and drafts a new constitution. That's what was done in 1787. That's what those delegates had the power to do, start from scratch, draft a new constitution. This is not in any way, shape, or form the same as a constitutional convention. This is an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments. Simply put, this is just a suggesting convention. And here's why it's different, because an Article 5 convention operates under the control of the article of the Constitution. Article 5, it says what can and can't be done. And it means that it is part of the existing Constitution, not in purpose to draft a new Constitution. And it only has the authority granted to it by the states who call for the convention.
Here.
My name is Georgia. And what do you think about sending senators from the state rather than by the people have their, if you know what I mean? I remember we used to do that, and we voted it away. I'd like to know what you think.
So what you're talking about, Georgia, is the 17th Amendment. So the 17th Amendment changed our system of governance for the worse in a very big way. And here's what it did. And you remember this, which is incredible. Most people don't even know that our state legislatures used to send senators to Washington, D.C. They would pick them and send them to D.C. And their purpose specifically was to represent your state's interest in Washington, D.C. Not the people, by the way, your state as an entity. They were essentially the lobbyists for the state. They had the easiest job ever in American history in governance. They had a one-word job. Their job was to say no all the time to the federal government. The founders knew they would encroach on the states, and the senators were supposed to say no all the time. We flipped that with the 17th Amendment, made them popularly elected. Now, we did it for a reason that I think is, it's not a bad reason. I don't think people were trying to do something untoward. What they said is, at the time of the 17th Amendment, it seemed like only rich, powerful people who are well-connected could get to the US Senate. That sound familiar to anybody? So we had a solution that didn't fix the problem. It created all kinds of problems. Yeah, personally, I would be in favor of repealing the 17th Amendment. However, I want to be honest about this. I don't believe that would happen in the first convention. And I think it's very difficult to explain to folks broadly why we think they shouldn't vote for their own senator. I think it's a healthier system of governance, but I think it'll take us a while to educate the American public about that.
Who's got a question for our speaker? Questions right over here.
Oh, yeah.
Could you say your first name, please?
Bob runs Westchester Tea Party. Had a small business, quality control, and my son bought it. Okay. This is a question, knowing and be able to explain the Constitution, the basics of the Constitution are very important. How can this be used to counter the leftward trend in our country? That's a big question. And another one, what's driving the Western trend, leftist trend? And I think this question needs a lot of research by the conservatives. We don't really know what we're up against. They have organizing for action under former president and trying to be president number 3, Obama. And I think we have to get a good feel on what's doable and what's the leftward trend from Democrats and Republicans. Okay.
So I'm going to answer the second question first, what I think is driving the leftward trend. And I actually think we do have a pretty good idea, Bob. There is a series of books I would recommend that you read if you've got a lot of time on your hands. And that is David Horowitz's 9-volume little black book of the American left. Literally just released the last, David Horowitz is the author. I could tell you, I mean, there's a long talk we could do on what's driving this. This is literally at its core is Marxism. That's what's driving the leftward trend in America. It starts back around the Wilson era. There were a lot of folks that pre-Wilson sent their children to Germany. They were really interested in what was going on in the Weimar Empire at the time and the efficiencies of the Weimar Empire. Those people brought this back, and that's been infecting our culture ever since. There's literally, you guys could do a series of classes on this stuff, and I'm not the expert. I would also say the most important mechanism by which that's being driven today in America is the media. Now, we all talk about the fake news and the fake media and all this stuff, but this is important to understand. The Annenberg Center for the Study of Journalism, or Media and Journalism at UCLA, did a study, and they determined, this is not a right-wing organization, by the way, that if you remove the influence of American mainstream media from the American body politic, today, American politics would look pretty much like Texas politics. Texas politics would be the norm. So that shows you where we fall naturally as a population, culturally, versus what the left-wing media has done to us. So media has an incredible impact. So that's negative stuff. I'm going to close the answer to that question with some hope, though, right? Because I have a lot of hope. In fact, I'm pretty confident that we're going to reverse all this. Here's why. So the media has been against America since at least the 1960s. Really, the 1960s is where it starts full swing. The media turns against the idea of America and Americanism. We also have academia against the idea of America and Americanism, probably starting around the same time, though I would take it back even further to the Wilson era and Dewey and these people who reinvented our education system. And then you have government itself, right? For at least 100 years, telling us that big government is the solution to our problems. Those are massive problems. I'm not worried about them. I mean, I think they're bad, but here's the thing. Here we are today, 100 years of this madness, the education system, K through postgraduate, the media, government itself, and today, 72% of Americans say that the federal government is too big and does too much. Those are extraordinary numbers in light of the propaganda that's been pushed on us. And so I think what that tells us, and why I'm hopeful, is it tells us the American people are naturally wired against this stuff. It's our job to feed them the correct narrative about what's really going on in the country.
Question right here.
My name is Gene. Recently, you were on Steve Hilton's show, and Tommy Lahren and Jason Chaffetz pretty much threw you under the bus. Steve, I think, is probably in favor of it. He also referenced Mike Lee. So what is it that guys like Mike Lee or other legislators, what is their big fear?
So a brief story about that. This is one of the things I love to do is I get to go on TV. And it's kind of funny. If you guys saw me at home, like I'm a redneck. When I flew in, I'm wearing my cowboy hat and my rodeo buckle from the Reno Rodeo and my dirty work boots. I mean, that's my normal clothes, right? So it always cracks me up that they put a guy like me on TV, probably because my wife makes me dress nice when I'm in public. But I was on that show and I got invited to be on the show. Steve Hilton is a big supporter of Convention of States. So I just thought this is going to be a softball interview, no problem. My studio, by the way, it looks really fancy. That's in my barn. That's just me sitting in front of a screen in my barn. So it's nothing fancy. So I'm there, and about an hour before the show, I get an email from the producer saying, hey, we'd love you to stick around after your segment. There's going to be a panel. So we'd love you to be on the panel. And I just think, well, that's great. Instead of 3 minutes, I'll get 6 minutes. How cool is that, right? They don't tell me we've got the firing squad set up on either side of you. So now the truth is I don't mind because I kind of enjoy the combat. I'm just one of those people. So I do the hit, and as I come on there, for those of you who didn't see it, it's very positive with Steve Hilton. They come on and they both say, essentially, this is the stupidest idea ever invented by mankind, right? And they don't really know what they're talking about, and we get into it. It's kind of fun if you want to go watch it. Just so you know, I was enjoying myself, right? So this is how it concludes, by the way, in case you want to know kind of how it went. I said to Tommy Lahren, you understand that you're standing with all the socialists and Marxists in the country, people like Hillary Clinton and George Soros and every leftist organization in America. And she said, well, maybe the socialists and Marxists are right about this. That's how far this thing degrades. So that's the end. They did mention Mike Lee. Here's the thing about Mike Lee, and I wasn't going to get into that fight. Mike Lee is not against this. I will tell you, I have never heard him say he's for it, but he's not against it. And I know this directly from Mark Levin, who's engaged in conversations with him, and Jim DeMint and Tom Coburn. He's never taken a position on it. So that was just a false flag when he said Levin's against or Lee's against it. But those two folks literally just had no idea what they were talking about.
Mark, we have 2 questions online.
Yes.
Jay, could you give us the questions online,
Yes.
please?
Sure will. A couple of questions. The first one is, it simply says, what is to prevent a runaway convention? And I'm going to make my own assumption that probably what she has in mind is not being able to control the delegates and maybe getting people to want to repeal the Second Amendment, or maybe they want to add an amendment to say the federal government responsible for our health care. Who knows? Could be just something like that.
And I hear this question all over the country. I think it's actually the question. The only serious question I get with people who are really opposed is this idea of a runaway convention. Right? So I think it's really important you hear this one. And I'm going to tell you what they say. I'm going to make their argument as best I can to start. And if there's anybody here that's on that side of the fight, I'm happy to hear from you also. But basically the argument goes like this. It starts with this. 1787 was a runaway convention because those men were sent there just to amend the Articles of Confederation, and they invented a whole new constitution. That's phase 1 of the argument. So if we couldn't trust the founders, then how could we trust people today? There are no Madisons, Adams, Jeffersons, et cetera, around anymore, no Washington to preside over the convention. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is, We're going to get in convention, and what's going to happen in convention is the radical left is going to take over the convention. They're going to do away with the right to free speech. The one I hear most often is they're going to do away with or severely curtail the Second Amendment. Because once the delegates are in there, there's nothing that can be done to control them. And the left is so much better at organizing than us. So why do you think you can control this convention? And that's my best kind of overall description. And if anybody wants to add to that, I'm happy to have it. I'm really trying to give you kind of an honest appraisal of what I hear all over the country from the opposition. Now, I'm going to answer that as if I'm in a debate with myself. I'm going to the smarter, more handsome panelists right now. And this is my response to that. First of all, if you're going to make an argument in a political debate, I think it's really important that you know where your argument comes from. I can tell you 95% of the people that will say what I just said have no idea where their argument comes from. They haven't done the homework, they haven't done the research, and I'm not criticizing them for that. That's not normal. Like, we take the opinions of people we hear and respect, and we don't necessarily dig in. But here's the deal, this is where it comes from. It comes from the radical American left. Now that's gonna shock some conservatives that think they're more conservative than me, and that's why they're trying to say this stuff. But here's where it comes from. In 1973, anybody know what the big Supreme Court decision is of the 1973 Supreme Court term? Roe v. Wade. Who's the presiding Supreme Court justice over Roe v. Wade? Anybody know? Warren Burger is the presiding justice over Roe v. Wade. 73 happens, a bunch of states start to pass resolutions, Article 5 resolutions, to call a convention to overturn Roe versus Wade, right? This is what states are supposed to do when we don't like what the Supreme Court does. It's a much more conservative country back then, and so states start doing this. Well, ultimately, the left gets a little bit freaked out about this. They're really worried that this is going to happen. And unfortunately, this is an unfortunate turn of events where one of my heroes of my life, Phyllis Schlafly of Eagle Forum, writes a letter to Chief Justice Warren Burger. And she asked the Chief Justice, what do you think of this idea of a convention? Anybody guess what Warren Burger would say about that? He would say it's a terrible idea. This is what he said, terrible idea, runaway convention, we could lose our beloved Constitution. And Phyllis unfortunately takes that letter and travels around the country with it for the next 40 plus years. 1982, we get within 2 states of a balanced budget convention. Phyllis Schlafly and the AFL-CIO together defeat that effort. By the way, we had an incredible, massive, unbelievable federal debt at that point of $1.7 trillion. That's wishful thinking today, right? So this is how that idea gets started. This is really important. And then they go to professors at Yale and Harvard, not exactly bastions of conservatism, have them write articles about the runaway convention, and the myth is born. That's where this all comes from. Now, that sounds like a wild conspiracy story by Mark Meckler, that the left did this all these years ago, and this crazy story has floated around the country for decades and decades, and nobody ever noticed. But let's make it real time, modern time, right? So you can know whether we are conservative or liberal. You can know whether liberals love this or hate it, and conservatives love or hate it by the bedfellows we keep and by the enemies that we derive from this process. On Good Friday, exactly 1 year ago, Good Friday, 230 of the most radical, leftist, Marxist, centralizing, statist groups in America signed a joint press release led by Common Cause and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, saying this was the most dangerous thing going on in America. So if you say these things about runaway convention, it's important that you know, if you're watching out there, if you're here, you're standing with George Soros. Hillary Clinton has spoken out against this directly. Robert Reich just made a video about this, saying this is the most dangerous thing to happen in America today. And you know what? Generally speaking, my experience with the radical left is they're not very honest. Would you guys agree with that? They said something unbelievably honest. They said that we intend to push back 115 years of progressive policy. And that's what we're doing today.
We've got one more question.
Okay, we do have a second online question. This is from Keith. It was asking, how realistic is it to get enough states to ratify this Convention of States proposal?
I think it's highly realistic, and here's why. Today, there are 33 state legislatures with both houses controlled by Republicans. It takes 34 to get to a convention. The math's not hard, right? Now, that doesn't mean every Republican state legislature is going to be easy. It's not an easy task. This is a tall hill to climb than it was intended to be. But the American body politic is much more conservative than what we see in Washington, D.C. The state legislatures, frankly, even in the liberal states, are more conservative than the legislators in Washington, D.C. So I believe we're going to get it done. 3.5 million. And you look at the people who are on board: Senator Tom Coburn, Senator Jim DeMint, Senator Ben Sass, Senator Marco Rubio, all the big talk show guys, Sean Hannity. It's incredible. And by the way, for those of you that come from the evangelical community, Dr. James Dobson just endorsed last week. There's a big radio show being broadcast today and tomorrow about it.
Question right here.
As a volunteer, you know me, Mark. As a volunteer, I hear a lot of people concerned with the delegate selection process, not what the delegates will do once they get there. But you gave a very good explanation of that as well last week in the radio. And one last thing is a comment. It's not a question. We run into our opposition using worst case scenarios. The problem is the probability of those scenarios in many cases are very low. And it's like boarding an airplane. You know that you could die if something was wrong with the engines, but you still get on. Because there's over.
So I try not to think about that.
Okay. Well, there's over 5,000 airplanes in the skies over the United States every day. So, it's just crazy.
Well, let me give you this. Let me give you the safety, because there is a safety mechanism, right? And so here's the safety in the end. So we talked a little bit about where this runaway argument comes from, but let's just defeat it in its entirety. If I can have a minute for that, Dan. Mm-hmm. Look, in the end, it takes 38 states to ratify whatever comes out of convention, right? That's a very high bar. Hard to get to 38 states. You have to get to 34 to call, 38 to ratify. It's 3/4 of states. And so let's deal with the one issue that people tell me they're the most scared of. And that issue is that you're going to have 3/4 of the states ratify the idea that we're going to do away with the Second Amendment or limit the Second Amendment. Now remember, if it takes 38 states to ratify something, it takes only 13 states to stop it, right? The inverse math means that the 13 most conservative states in America can stop anything they want. It means that one house in each of the legislatures of 13 states, it means that one committee chair on the Judiciary Committee or the State Gov Committee can stop it in each of the 13 most conservative states. So I want you to think about this, okay? I'm from California, not exactly the most conservative state, but I want you to think about Texas and Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee and the Carolinas and Nebraska and Wyoming and the Dakotas and in Florida and Georgia. And I want you to think about this. Imagine going into those legislatures and suggesting that they ought to vote for taking away your guns. Now, I've been in all of those legislatures, and I would tell you, if you go in there and make that suggestion for your own safety, I hope you're packing heat.
Here's another question right here. Would you say your first name, please?
My name's Ken. First, thank you for coming. Appreciate being here. I've learned a lot. From all the conversations you had, do you expect there will be a big triggering event that might force the hand on the Convention of States? And what might that triggering event be?
When you say a triggering event, you mean something that might accelerate the process? I hate to even say this, but I am worried about the midterm elections. And I do believe that if you see the Democrats take control of the House of Representatives, God forbid, there will be impeachment proceedings. And I think rapidly you will see the American body politic move towards calling a convention of states, because DC is so bad right now. We're not seeing 10% of the madness we'll see if that happens, if there are impeachment proceedings. So I think that's potentially a very rapid triggering event.
We have a question online right here, Mark.
Okay, Lloyd is asking, does the U.S. Congress have any part to play as far as approving or disapproving the suggested amendments that come out of the convention of the states, or will the states alone, if the required number of states approve, the amendments be satisfactory for the final approval?
The simple answer is Congress has absolutely no role, and the overlay I want to put over that is, remember, for those of us who call ourselves originalists and believe in original intent, the entire purpose of this second clause of Article 5 was to wire around Congress, because the founders thought that Congress would ultimately be a problem. So that you will hear people say, well, Congress is going to take control of it. Congress has no legal right to take control. They have no authority to take control. There's no history to support their control. They cannot and will not be involved in the convention at all. One more online.
Nancy is asking, you mentioned the media influencing our culture, but the educational institutions are brainwashing our young people. Don't you think that it's another problem to overcome, even though you say we are wired? Wouldn't there be a delay in them not getting this whole thing and being our future leaders?
You know, this for me is one of the core issues in America today, which is our educational institutions have been polluted by bad ideas, by a teaching of a false history and a false narrative. So I think one of the things that's most important, Nancy, you'd probably agree with me, is that we need to educate the American populace. The idea of education is critically important. The number one possibility for doing the largest constitutional education project in the history of the United States of America is the Convention of States Project. What we want to do more than anything else is to be having openly, boldly, a national debate about what the proper size, scope, and jurisdiction of the federal government is. Because frankly, most Americans don't like the overburdensome, the overbloated, the overpowering federal government. So we want to have that debate on a national scale. Imagine what it will be like, even when we get close to convention, but especially if we get in convention, what will happen is everybody in the whole country will be watching. It will be like the Super Bowl, the World Series, the World Cup, and the Kentucky Derby all rolled together, and Buckeye football.
My name is David. What can we do as individuals to, get involved and make this happen?
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. And David is very involved, by the way, so I appreciate that question, David. And the answer is get involved. And this is the thing, when the founders put that in, it wasn't a mechanism for some elite people who knew about the Constitution to do something. It was a mechanism designed for the people to rise up. Why? Because they understood how government worked best. It's really weird because they gave this unique power to the state legislators, right? I don't want you to think about that. When you go talk to a state legislator, ask them what their role is in the federal government, they have no idea. But they're the only people in this country that were empowered by the founders to call a convention, propose amendments, and ratify amendments, thereby changing the structure of our founding document. It's an incredible authority. Why were they given that authority? And this goes to answer your question, because the founders like government close to regular people. So what you can do, what we can do as regular people, is be involved, talk to your own state legislators, let them know you support this and you want them to do this. And I'm just going to cast my vote, even though I'm not going to be here. I think this is a great project for Empower You. I'm just saying.
My name is Mel, and I haven't completely formulated exactly how to put this, but it seems to me as though a lot of us have been anti-educated in that if it is not our specialty, we are not qualified to do it. I see people that can't even do simple repairs on their own house. Simple repairs, like putting up a picture frame or whatever, because they've been educated away from it. You need to be a specialist. You need to have a certification. You need to have a license, whatever. And so what do we do to improve not just our academic education, but our personal education?
Well, I mean, I would say individually what we do is what you're all doing, because you're here, right? And you tell other people about Empower You, and you bring them here and you get educated, you read. That's what we do. But I think as a society, what we do is we elevate a project like this. Like, one of the things that I think is going to be so interesting about this and so exciting and so positive is it's like the biggest sporting event in the world. I mean, think how crazy people get during presidential elections. Almost everybody's paying attention, right? A vast majority of the American public is paying attention during a presidential election. I can guarantee you, this will be much bigger, much more intriguing, much more exciting. It'll be covered like all those sports events I said. So I think, and I think this is what the founders expected, by the way, that we need to start thinking of our politics more like we think of sports, like more the way, like we pay attention, we know the stats, we're engaged. The only way we do that is we create stuff that is empowering enough where people feel like it's worth being involved. They can actually make a change. So this is something that is actually a solution as big as the problem. So I think it engages people.
My name is Dwight. If you do get to the convention, is there going to be a limitation on what you think you can pass? Or are you going to go for everything? Or you're thinking about more than one convention to have?
So at convention, the convention is limited by the subject matter resolution passed out of the state legislatures. Those 3 subject matter areas I discussed, anything that would put fiscal restraints on the federal government, anything that might impose term limits on federal officials, and anything that might limit the scope and the power of jurisdiction of the federal government. Those are the only things that can be talked about. The idea of how many amendments will come out of convention, it's hard to say. When we did the simulated convention in Williamsburg, we ended up having 6 amendments passed out of that convention for consideration. You know, it just depends on how many they can get to, how many they can agree upon. It's not going to be easy. So I think it's going to be less rather than more.
And Mark, you may have mentioned it, but you said each state gets to decide how many representatives they send to the convention?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. How the delegates get chosen is really interesting to me. I'm a federalist through and through. I love state power. I think the states should have the power. And when I say I love state power, I love people power most, right? And so people have most of the powers are reserved to the people, then to the states. And so the way it works is in true federalist fashion. Every state will decide how they choose their delegates and how many to choose. And I expect the delegations to be bigger rather than smaller, because the states are going to want to send experts in subject matter, economists, government specialists, historians on the structure of the country, but each state gets only a single vote. So whether it's Rhode Island or Ohio, voting power is going to be the same.
Thank you.
My name is Dick, and kind of to amplify the question that was asked previously, in your discussions around the country, talking to various legislatures, have they brought forth any additional ideas other than the 3 that you really talked about? Because when I talked to Bill Stites about this issue several years ago, he said balanced budget amendment was where the state of Ohio was going. Can you give us some sense for how other states are feeling about this, please?
Sure. So balanced budget amendment is a single subject idea, right? To go to convention with the idea of just imposing a balanced budget amendment. By the way, I'm a big fan of a balanced budget amendment with other restrictions. A balanced budget amendment on its own, in my opinion, is the worst Trojan horse possible. It is a stalking horse, and here's why. The federal government has the power to impose unfunded mandates on Ohio. They do it right now. So imagine what happens when we tell the federal government you can't spend any money, you have to balance your budget. Well, first of all, they can raise taxes. I think you need the authority to impose tax and spending caps also. But if you don't do any of that, and let's just say, what are they going to say? Do you think all those nice regulators in Washington, D.C. are just going to say, okay, well, then we'll just stop all these programs that you're trying to stop? No, they're going to say to your Ohio state legislators, hey, you guys, we have a bunch of new programs. Here are the rules. Here's how you operate them. Now you tax your citizens and you fund these programs. And so I think what it does is it transfers power. A balanced budget amendment alone by itself transfers power from the state to the federal government, or at least entices the federal government to take more power away from the states. So in other states and other things we're talking about, for example, term limits on Congress, term limits on Supreme Court justices and federal court justices, there's no reason for them to serve for life. Term limits, I think importantly, on federal bureaucrats. Scope and jurisdiction limitations, my favorite is the federal government shall not in any way, through enticement or the spending of money or regulation, be involved in the education of students or children inside the states.
One last question.
My name is Barbara. With all this education that would be required, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, how many generations would this in fact take to actually accomplish?
To get to convention?
To have people be educated enough to not, fear even people that are in the body of politics. Right. And, this might be a pursuit that you may not get to finish, or any of us. Right. It might be another generation or 2.
So I believe we're going to get it done in the next few years. Yeah, and here's why. We're polling this all across the country right now. We've polled it here in this state. And these are the numbers. I don't think the poll's publicly released yet. So you guys are going to get, this is kind of pre-release of your numbers.
And we have a handout on that in the back.
Perfect. So today, here, with very little education, 62% of Ohioans support this. Much higher number among Republicans and independents, over 50% among Democrats support this. And here's the reason why, and those numbers are consistent across the states. I think it goes as high as, I've seen it as high as 69% in some states that support it, and as low as about 61%. So 62% here support this across the board. There right now are about 44,000, 43,000 people that have signed the petition in this state. So when people learn about it, they like it. They like it for a very simple reason. It's about, actually, this is all complicated. We're talking about a bunch of seemingly complex stuff, right? I know too much is part of the problem. I've been doing this for 5 years. But here's the real essence of this argument. Do you believe that people in Ohio should decide for themselves, or do you believe that Washington, D.C. should decide for people in Ohio? That's the essence. That's the essence of the argument. And the question is, if you believe that people in Ohio should decide for themselves, what do you believe is the way that we're going to take that power back? And that's what Convention of States is all about.
Let's thank Mark for coming from California to see you and meet with you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So just a couple things I want to share with you in leaving. I think the other thing you should think about in essence is when the founders created that incredible document that we're celebrating tonight, did they really put that in there for a time when things would get so bad that we'd have to take some power back? Is that what they put Article 5 in there for? And that's your own decision. A couple things. Somebody said something about educating our youth. We've got our big Constitution boot camp number 48 on Saturday. It's 5 hours. Any student will get a $25 gift card to GameStop if they register for free. We'd love to have lots of kids there, and we'd love to see you. Okay, so Jim Lewis is our educator for our Constitution boot camp. He had a little different opposing view. Asked us to pass out a sheet of paper to you when you leave to let you read about what he thinks about Article 5, and I'll let you take one of those if you're interested. Mr. Bill Roll has one for you on the way out. Please grab a piece of cake. Celebrate Constitution Day. Thank you so much for starting off our first class at Empower U.